From Swagman Media, this is the Jolly Swagman podcast. Here are your hosts, Angus and Joe.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, swagmen and swaggettes. Welcome back to the Jolly Swagman podcast. I'm Joe Walker, and this is a very special highlights episode. Highlights? What are highlights? Highlights are great moments from a wider context. And what is our context? It is last year, a year known to many as 2018, a year that was crazy for our podcast. We grew, we had some outrageous conversations, and we interviewed some outstanding people. And we want to thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate our audience. Angus is overseas. He'll be back soon, and we'll be giving you an update when he returns. But for the meantime, enjoy these special moments from some of our 2018 interviews. They're mostly interviews I was involved in just because that's what I remember. I was there, and I hope you learn something. So, enjoy. Alrighty then, guys. So let's rip right in with what I think was one of the most underrated episodes of 2018, and that was my interview with Leonard Susskind. Now, who is Leonard? Leonard is the Felix Bloch Professor of Theoretical Physics at Stanford University. He's one of the fathers of string theory, which is one of the dominant, well, probably the dominant theoretical framework in physics at the moment. And he's one of two or three people who would be in line for the Nobel Prize if string theory ever received the empirical validation that it needs. I travelled out to Stanford campus in Palo Alto to meet Leonard, and when I arrived at the cafe, he was doing physics on a blank sheet of A4 paper with a big texter. I could see it over his shoulder. It was like something out of a movie. I have a huge crush on him, and I have physics envy as well, so it was really an absolute dream come true for me. And rather than going straight into talking about physics, we actually began with a series of very charming stories. I used to be quite skeptical of the value of stories. As someone who worked in policy, I saw too many instances of politicians designing public policy based on their own personal experience. And as they say, data is not the plural of anecdote. But over the last couple of years, my mind has been changed as I've learnt more about people and how they work. And I think stories do have great power to motivate, collectivize, inspire, and entertain us. And I always try to start a podcast interview with a few stories. Stories serve multiple functions in the podcast format. They open your mind and prepare you to receive more complex information towards the back half of the interview. They get you hooked on the episode and encourage you to keep listening because they're so entertaining. And they also help to situate the guest as well. This highlights reel is going to be no different. We're starting with some fantastic stories. And the first Leonard tells is very funny. It's the time he goes back to the Bronx in New York to tell his father that he's not going to be following him into the family profession. Oh, and by the way, the family profession is plumbing.
I went to college, CCNY, City College, which is a free college in New York. And the whole point of going to college was that my father wanted to go into the business of heating engineering. Heating engineering meant replacing all the furnaces and boilers in the tenement buildings in New York. And he didn't know enough about heat. He just didn't know enough about the engineering and mechanics of heat. He didn't know what a BTU was. BTU means a British thermal unit. And people kept quoting properties of furnaces and boilers in terms of BTUs, and he didn't know what a BTU was. So he told me I should go to college to find out what a BTU is. And that's what I did. I started college in engineering school. But after about a year or so, 2 years, more like 2 years, I realized engineering was not what I wanted to do. I'd taken a couple of physics classes, and I really got excited about it. I wanted to do physics. So at some point, I had to tell my father I wasn't going to be a plumber. I wasn't going to go into the heating engineering business with him. And so I was married. I had a kid. We went over to my father's house, and my father, he was a tough guy. He was, he had hands like a vice. He could squeeze walnuts and break them with one hand. and he was standing in front of one of our pieces of machinery, the pipe cutting machinery, cutting pipe for the next day's work. And I said to him, Benny, I called him Benny, you know, I don't think I'm going to be a plumber. I don't think that's what I want to do. And he looked at me, you know, with, you know, almost fierce fire in his eye. And he said, what do you mean you're not going to be a plumber? Or maybe I said engineer. I don't know. I'm not going to be an engineer. He said, what do you mean you're not going to be an engineer? What are you going to be? A ballet dancer? And I said, no, I'm not a ballet dancer. I'm going to be a physicist. And his reaction was very, very funny. I mean, it's hilarious in retrospect. He said, no, you're not going to work in a drugstore. A drugstore, I don't know if in Australia you use the same term, a pharmacist?
Yeah.
Pharmacist. He thought I meant pharmacist. He said, no, you're not going to work in a drugstore. And I said, no, Benny, I don't want to be a pharmacist. I want to be a physicist. And he said, what's a physicist? What the hell is a physicist? And we sort of skirted around it a few times. And then I said the magic word which just opened up the whole world for me. I said, a physicist like Einstein. Einstein? Einstein. He knew Einstein. Every Jew in the whole world knew who Einstein was.
Of course.
In fact, everybody altogether knew who Einstein was. And he said, you any good at this? And I said, yes, I think I'm very good at it. He thought for a little bit, and then he said, okay, you're going to be Einstein. Okay, that was good. But then my mother came in with my wife and my baby, and she was hysterical. She was convinced that we were going to starve. So, she was convinced that I wouldn't make any money, that we'd all starve. And she was crying about it. My father took a look at her and he just said, he was always very kind to my mother, but this time he just turned around, the fire in his eye, and he said, shut up, he's going to be Einstein. And that was the end of the story. That was it. I was then free to become a physicist.
The next story I discussed with Leonard, who turned 79 this year, was of his friend and mentor Richard Feynman. The late Richard Feynman. If you haven't heard of Feynman, Feynman was one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, worked on the Manhattan Project, won a Nobel Prize, and Leonard speaks movingly of their relationship. Feynman was 20 years Richard's senior, but they struck up a partnership and a friendship. And I talked to Leonard a bit about what Feynman was like as a scientist, but also as a person, because he was an incredibly colourful character.
Feynman was what you might call a man of many parts. He had he had the most unusual personality. He was a clown. He was a performer. He was a bongo drummer. He was a lover. He was everything you can think of that makes people interesting. And he was probably one of the two or three great theoretical physicists of the 20th century. So, and he loved to perform. And one of the kind of performances he loved was to show somebody how easy a thing could be, how easy a physics problem could be, when that other person, and the other person could have also been a great physicist, had made a calculation which was very difficult, very complicated, and Feynman would stand up and show you how to do it in 5 seconds. He loved that.
But it was like a party trick.
It was a party trick on the one hand, but it also represented the way the man thought about physics. Always simply, always with the easiest possible way to think about something, always with a way to think about it that could be explained easily, almost to a layperson. His Feynman diagrams, for example, were an example. And there was this funny mix of performer and great scientist, which was almost unique.
There's a great book which I'd recommend to listeners, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman.
Surely You're Joking.
Yeah.
Most of that book was had to do with things that took place before I knew him.
Right.
He was 20 years older than I am.
Yeah.
Than I was. Yeah.
There was a sense in which he would almost go out of his way to generate these anecdotes about himself.
Yeah. As far as I know, all of the anecdotes, that may have been embellished a little bit. He had a lot of fun talking about them and things. But as far as I know, they were all true. Mm-hmm. They all represented what had really happened. Mm-hmm. I don't think he made stuff up. But he loved being the center of attention. On the other hand, there was something else about him. You know, he liked a situation where, a competitive situation, who could be cleverer? And he almost always came out on top. And he loved it, and people sometimes felt resentful. But what I found out about him, we were close enough, and we had done this enough times that some of the games I had won. And he loved it just as much when I won as when he did. So there was room in his personality for other people to also be performers. I admired him probably beyond anybody else, but I also realized that there was a certain aspect to his personality which you could almost call clownish. Mm-hmm. Clownish in a good sense, a performer. And anyway, Richard was a dick. Dick was a very important formative influence on me.
So that was the last story, or the last highlight of Leonard Susskind that I'll share with you. I encourage you to go and listen to the rest of the interview. It's episode number 48. The next story he tells me about, for example, just as a little teaser, was of the time he first met Stephen Hawking in San Francisco and how a war between them ensued, which became known as the Black Hole War. They were arguing over the fundamental nature of black holes. Incredibly interesting and entertaining stuff. So that's episode 48. But we're moving on now. A few days, in fact, after meeting Leonard on Stanford campus, I took my hire car over San Francisco Bay to a chicken farm about an hour's north of the city in Sonoma County, California. And there I met a man who I regard as a hero and who many in the business regard as one of the best stock pickers in the world. It was the legendary short seller, Marc Cohodes. Marc has an incredible story, but the first story of his we're going to rip into for this highlight reel was of the time an SUV pulled up at the farm in December 2017. It was in relation to a tweet he'd been sending, and the SUV van contained, purportedly, 2 FBI agents who were there to see Marc about the tweet. Now, Marc had tweeted about a CEO of a company that he was shorting, so a company he was betting against. The company is known as MiMedx. Marc thinks it's the biggest fraud he's ever seen in his long and storied career as a short seller, and the then CEO, Parker Petit, happens to be about 5 foot tall. And Marc tweeted that he was going to, quote, bury the little fella in a shoebox. I just give you that as context for the story, but here's Marc.
These 2 guys show up, and I took pictures of them. I'm over at my son's house with him and a buddy of mine who has terminal cancer. My wife walks in or knocks on the door and says, "There's 2 guys from the FBI here to see you." I said, "No way." She says, "Yeah, way." He says, "It's about MiMedx." So I kind of gleefully go out the door thinking it's the feds wanting to talk to me about MiMedx, the FBI. And they said, they show me this badge without their ID. And they said, "Is there a place we can go and talk about MiMedx?" I said, "Sure, come to the house." So we go inside. And they say, "We're here to talk about MiMedx and threatening tweets you've made to Parker Petit." And I said, am I the subject of an investigation?" They said, "No." I said, "Do you have a warrant?" They said, "No. This is a courtesy visit." I said, "Okay." I said, "Do I need to call my lawyer?" They said, "No." "Okay." I said, "Can you please get the fuck out of my house?" And they said, "No, not until we talk to you." So my wife's name, Aurora. I said, "Aurora, can you call the sheriff?" because we're in rural here. I said, can you call the sheriff and tell him I got 2 unwanted guests who claim to be with the FBI, but I don't know if they are. And then I just keep trying to call my lawyer, and these 2 guys won't leave, and they keep asking me about these tweets. And I'm like thinking they're innocuous tweets, and one of them is the shoebox one. Mm-hmm. But that was only in response to being baited by these other guys, and it was only, jocular.
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone who reads it would know that you were being facetious.
I get that. But I eventually got a hold of my lawyer, or he called me back and told these guys to leave the house and talk to him. And they were, trying to talk rough with him. And
they refused to leave?
They refused to leave till the sheriff showed up, and the sheriff shoot them. But they were actually with the FBI. But I've known, because my life's been threatened more than once by some ruffians, that the FBI really doesn't care. They say, when we had hard evidence of some troublemakers, the FBI said, call your local police, which we did. So to gin up a visit by the FBI out of Atlanta to Sonoma County, California, to tell a guy to quit tweeting, stop tweeting, when Twitter never asked me to stop. If Twitter had a problem with my tweets, Twitter would have suspended my account or sent me something, but they never did. That's the first line of defense. If Twitter thinks there is a problem or a risk, Twitter would then call law enforcement and say, we think we have a problem here. So I'm of the belief that Parker called his influencing, peddling Senator Isaacson, and Isaacson ginned up the FBI visit. And I will get to the bottom of it one day, and there will be hell to pay one day. One day, when this thing's said and done, I'm going to settle it with some of these guys.
If you're wondering, the MyMedics story is still continuing. MyMedics, the company we were talking about in that conversation just there with Marc, is a biopharmaceutical company. They have a patented technology, Purion technology they call it, which is basically taking tissue from used placentas and using them for epigrafts in wound treatment. But anyway, in September, about 4 months after I recorded that conversation with Marc, the board of the company revealed that the CEO, Parker Petit, had been terminated for cause, both as CEO and as chairman of the board. And the company's stock price has tanked. Marc still thinks it's the biggest fraud, pound for pound, he's ever seen, and he thinks it's likely to be heading to bankruptcy. So watch this space. There'll be many more tales told about the battle between Marc and MyMedics in the future. But my episode with Marc, which was 3 hours long, I released the whole thing, was our most popular episode of the year. And it was shared widely on Twitter. And in contemplating why, I think it was a lot down to Marc's character. Marc is almost an archetypal hero. He's a very insider/outsider simultaneous person. Someone who's worked on Wall Street, is very wealthy, but at the same time is a sort of eccentric maverick. He's gone through the hero's journey. When his fund collapsed in the global financial crisis, he sort of went into exile, so to speak, on the chicken farm, but then stunningly came out of retirement in 2016 and started fighting big companies like MyMedics. And he's someone with real skin in the game, which is why I think people admire him so much and why I look up to him. And skin in the game is important because courage is the only virtue that can't be faked, as Nassim Taleb says. Another guest I had on in 2018 with amazing skin in the game is Yanis Varoufakis, who was the former Greek finance minister. He was finance minister in 2015. I think it was from January to July. It was only a few months, but he ended up falling on his sword and resigning for his beliefs. He's an amazing guy. He was a professor of economics before his brief stint in politics. And in this following highlight, I asked him about what happened to Greece in 2012, what it was like they're in the middle of their sovereign debt crises, and his wife, Danae, who's an artist, puts on an art exhibition in downtown Athens. And she solicits responses from the Greek public over social media and asks them to tell her the one word they fear the most. And the word that they receive, the most frequent response, is surprising to both Danae and Yanis.
2012 was 2 years after Greece became bankrupt and got caught up in this Ponzi scheme of the bailouts. Poverty was rising extremely fast. And most people were feeling that it was as if, the earth had subsided and we were falling into a black hole. That's what most people were feeling. So what then I did was to issue a public call and ask people to answer, to send an answer, a one-word answer to two questions. They could choose which questions they answer. One was, what do you want to? What are you most scared of? What are you most threatened by? In one word. And the other question was, what is it that you want to preserve the most, to safeguard? So all sorts of words came. But what was fantastic was that, and what she then did was she took each one of those words, she created 100 black metal boxes, and she put each word in one of those metal boxes, and it created an installation with sound and fury and visuals. And she called it "It's time to open the black boxes." The idea being that, unlike the aeroplane where the black box is discovered after the accident, the idea is to open the black box before our society crashes. So that's more. She's the artist. But what was interesting was that the word that came back with the greatest frequency was the word dignity. It's what the Greeks feared that they were losing the most. And what they wanted to preserve the most. And it was fantastic. It was not jobs, it wasn't money, it wasn't savings, it was dignity.
Wow. And tragically, there was a wave of suicides washing over the country at that time. I think the suicide rate in Crete might have been the worst, and that's traditionally a very proud island.
Yeah. Well, Cretans are very proud people. So, and they have guns. Crete is the Texas of Greece.
Right.
So for some reason, they love their guns, AK-47s, all sorts of things. And so, proud people with guns kill themselves rather than go through the indignity of admitting their bankruptcy, of begging the bankers for a restructure of their debts and so on and so forth. But you see, it's not just back in 2012. To this day, the suicide rate in Greece is double what it used to be before the crisis, and it is continuing.
One of my goals in 2018 was to wake people up more to the idea of a recession and its real human costs. As they famously say, one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. I think it was Stalin who's reputed to have said that. And I think that's true. When you talk about abstract economic ideas like recessions, it's hard to translate them into the human costs. And that's why I wanted Yanis to paint a picture of how bad the climate was in Greece. He spoke about the suicides just there, because I think Australia is in serious economic trouble at the moment. And I want people to be more alive to this idea, because complacency is only going to mean that we're more unprepared. And my next guest on that topic is Kevin Rudd. Now, the first Kevin Rudd highlight is us talking about Kevin was Prime Minister of Australia, and he was Prime Minister during the global financial crisis. And we speak about that weekend in October when the Australian government was contemplating a run on the banks the following Monday, and they had to act decisively. The choice was, do we guarantee the banks or do we let them fail? Have a listen. Here's Kevin Rudd.
Had the sovereign guarantees that I signed off on that fateful weekend in November not worked, then I would have been held accountable in history as the Prime Minister who signed off literally $1 trillion plus worth of financial guarantees to a bunch of private banks only to see it all blow up. It's a very focusing moment when you do that.
What was the feeling like in the room at the time?
It was one of deep anxiety because we knew what we were facing. It was one of analytical clarity because I wanted us above all to spend time getting the analysis right, both of what was happening in financial markets on day one of that critical weekend when we took the decisions on the guarantees both for interbank lending but equally critically for everyone's savings deposits as well. Combined guarantees worth a cool $2.5 trillion. Signed, Kevin Rudd, graduate Nambour High School. By the way, Year 12 economics.
Did you have any hesitation about doing it?
No, because there's never anything perfect in public policy. Usually it's the question of which is the least bad of these options, or on balance, which is the better of several options put before you. But intellectually, we've been working to this point for some time, in the midst of everything else you happen to be doing in government at this time. So it was the right course of action, but it ultimately hangs on me. I'm the Prime Minister, so take out your fountain pen and sign on the bottom line, which is what I did. But it worked, and we had no run on the Australian banks. No one lost their savings deposits. Our banks did all their interbank lending for the subsequent, I think, 3 months using the guarantee that we provided. And then by the time we got to month 4, month 5, it was partially used. By about 6 months out, markets had begun to stabilise, particularly after the March 2009 London summit of the G20. Hairy months.
The second and final Kevin Rudd highlight I'm going to share with you is us talking about a famous essay he wrote in the Monthly after the events of that weekend in October. The essay was published in February 2009, I believe, and published in the Monthly magazine. And it entails Kevin taking apart the efficient markets hypothesis and neoliberalism and blaming them as the fundamental causes of the global financial crisis. Now, my purpose in asking him about this, which may not have been immediately apparent at the time, was to get him to pin his colours to the mast on the question of the efficient markets hypothesis. The implication of that would have been accepting the fact that bubbles do exist in financial and asset markets. And that gave me the perfect opening to ask him whether he thinks that some of the measures he took in staving off Great Recession in 2007 and 8 have now set Australia up for potentially an even more devastating crisis, whether Rudd himself reinflated the housing bubble with some of his measures, particularly the first home buyers boost. Now, I guess that means that not even we at the Jolly Swagman are beyond a gotcha moment, but I've also included this highlight here because I think there's something charming about both a political leader writing a 10,000-word essay and being so well-versed in the history of economic thought. It's particularly refreshing in an age when the ostensible leader of the free world has likely never read a book. And sadly, while voters tend to reward self-confidence more than intellectual curiosity, I think it's safe to say Rudd has spades of both. See what you think.
If you look at the intellectual pedigree of this school of financial economics, it does proceed from Haidt through the Chicago School and through efficient markets hypothesis, as you've just described. But it pays no account whatsoever to what Keynes at an earlier stage had correctly identified as the animal spirits. And anyone who thinks that markets under these sorts of circumstances act as perfect rational barometers of rational self-interest has got rocks in their head or they're smoking something. So I came to that conclusion about efficient markets theory as someone who intrinsically believes in markets. I'm a disciple of Adam Smith, both volumes, Theory of Moral Sentiments plus The Wealth of Nations, and Smith's elegant theory of price, which frankly is the revolution in modern economics over the last 200 years. But Smith would describe himself, and has been described legitimately since, as a political economist. He would see himself actually as a moral theologian at the time. And the bottom line is, it ain't purely a function of markets. There is a role for the public good in the regulation of markets. But Hayek, who was Keynes's great rival, basically in the economic theoretical debates of most of the first half of the 20th century, because of his own experiences in Eastern Europe and road to serfdom and everything else, had such an instinctive emotional reaction against any control by the state that it pushed him in the reverse direction. And if you go to the reductio ad absurdum infinitum of Hayek's thesis, and you ask, well, why does this ultimately work? And he's reduced to this primitive argument of this ancient game of chance deployed, I think, by the ancient Greeks called catalexy. And that formed his crucible of logical argument in defence of efficient markets, well, his concept of efficient unregulated markets. I think that ultimately it rested, therefore, on a form of his own primitive deism. That there was some ultimate invisible hand holding all this together. Whereas Smith, I think, had a much more sober view of where markets were located within the wider responsibilities of society and the state.
As Joseph Stiglitz said, the reason the invisible hand seems invisible is because it's not really there.
Well, I love Joe's comment on that score. It's a great line. I think I've also quoted it in perhaps that piece in the Monthly.
The next highlight I'm going to share sees me in New Jersey last year, catching up with a friend and professor of statistics at Rutgers University, Harry Crane. This turned out to be a really popular episode, which was delightful to me because it was purely about statistics and probability, topics which on the surface might seem very dry, but which we made relevant and made interesting to people. I think people really enjoyed this. And in this particular highlight, we discussed Harry's gripes with the prediction expert Nate Silver. And Harry also introduces his controversial idea of the first rule of probability. See what you think.
I found the whole experience of the most recent election in America to be very interesting from my perspective, because at the time, I guess at that time I had just started this seminar on probability, and so we were meeting every week and we were talking about all these ways in which probability comes up. And here you have a real life event that's going on that the news media is reporting news that isn't, they're reporting things that are supposedly happening in the world, but they're also making a major part of their news operation just reporting these probabilities that are being calculated, in principle, based on the things that they're reporting. So it's really, it was interesting to me, especially, I guess, the story that really sticks in my head was I remember sometime in September, right after the first debate, Trump had I think outperformed what everybody was expecting in the first debate, and a lot of people were kind of, well, at that time, regardless of what people were saying, Nate Silver, the 538 probability took him from something like 20% to win to like 35% to win, all in the span of a day. And I just remember sitting around the room and hearing people talk about this, and they were legitimately worried. They were like shaking. And they weren't shaken by anything that actually happened in the debate. They were shaken by the fact that the probability changed, and that now the probability was a lot higher than they wanted it to be, because these were people who were, I guess, Clinton supporters, right? And so this really struck me that I had been thinking for a long time, I guess, in the kind of weeks and months leading up to that, what do these probabilities actually mean? I have no idea what these probabilities actually mean. I mean, if you think about it. And then I wrote something about this after the election happened, which was, in 2008, I think 538 gave Obama something like a 90% probability to win. And, at that time, Silver was really heralded as this great prognosticator, and that he got it right? He got everything right. And then in 2012, he gave a similarly high, a lower but a similarly high probability for Obama in the 80% range. And so again, he was said to have gotten it right. And then after the 2016 election, where he gave Trump 28% chance to win, you still had people coming out and saying that he got it right again. And these people were what they were pointing out was, well, when you say that something's going to happen 25% of the time, or when you say that something has a probability of 25%, that means it's going to happen 25% of the time. And so the fact that this thing happened doesn't invalidate the probability. And so when you start to get into that realm of interpreting these probabilities, then it means that pretty much nothing that is said other than an extreme 0% or a 1% or a 100% probability is falsifiable, right? And so that means
because you can't replicate election, you can't run multiple versions of the same election and see how frequently Trump wins or.
Right, and apparently, no matter what comes out, you're going to be able to say that it's consistent with whatever you predicted, right? So it really renders the probabilities meaningless, at least from my point of view, unless I guess this is something that I've been I've been working on recently or thinking about recently, and I showed you an early draft of this. Unless these probabilities are tied to something real, right? And so this is something that I'm calling the first rule of probability. And it should be the last rule of probability too, which is if you state a probability on any outcome, then you should be forced to accept any bet on that outcome at the implied odds, right? So if I state a probability of something being 1%, then I should be forced to offer you 99 to 1 odds if you wanted to bet on the other side. And of course, if I lose that bet, I have to pay up, right? That's the only way, at least the only way that I can see, and this is something that, going back to Reds, the guy at the bowling alley, this is something that he knew very well, and all the people who were dealing with him knew very well. These probabilities that you state, or the odds that you state, don't mean anything unless they have real consequences.
It's been said that happiness comes from between, and life is largely defined by the people you spend your time with. And in this next highlight, my co-host Angus and I speak to the Oxford Don Robin Dunbar. Now, Robin is best known for Dunbar's number. You may have heard that term before. Dunbar's number is 150, which is roughly the cognitive limit on the amount of people you can hold meaningful relationships with at any one point in time. But what's interesting and what most people might not know is it's not Dunbar's number, singular, it's actually Dunbar's numbers, plural, because there's a series of numbers from 5 all the way to 1,500, which are like concentric circles and which define different categories of relationships in your life. And 150 is one of the most important of those sets, but it's somewhere in the middle, sandwiched between a range of other types of relationships. So I'll hand over to Robin Dunbar to explain this concept in more detail.
You have a sort of natural grouping at about 150, which is kind of the number of people you have meaningful relationships with. Varies a bit, perhaps between about 100 and 250, but the average is 150. And then within that, you can see these structured layers of relationships of increasing intensity coming in towards you. So it's a bit like the ripples on a pond where you throw the stone in. So you're the stone and you're surrounded by these layers. And as you go out, each layer is bigger, includes more people, but the relationship quality is weaker. So the wave is getting smaller and smaller. What's really weird is these layers are structured in a very consistent pattern. Each layer is 3 times the size of the one inside it. So you typically have about 1.5 really intense relationships. So that would be your kind of romantic partner and maybe, a best mate or something. And then you have 5 intimate friends, 15 best friends, 50 good friends, 150 friends. And then we know it goes on with 2 more layers outside that at least, 1 to 500, which we think of as acquaintances. So acquaintances are the guys you go and work with perhaps a lot of the time. You might even have a beer with them after work, but you're not going to invite them to your big 5-0 party or your wedding or your funeral. And then 1,500 turns out to be the outermost limit, turns out to be the number of faces you can put names to. And a lot of those people, they don't know who you are necessarily. So for most people in any given country, one of them would be your prime minister. Everybody knows who your prime minister is. But if you bumped into him or her in the street and slapped them on the back and said, come and have a beer, the likelihood is a very large man in a big overcoat with a big bulge under his left armpit would be hustling you away. So they don't know who you are, even if you know them. It's those kind of relationships. Now, those kind of relationships are very different to the ones that are within your 150, where those relationships are strictly reciprocal. You know them, they know you.
Another idea Robin explained to us was the importance of frequency of contact in maintaining friendships and keeping people within those lower circles under the 150 mark. I distilled this into a heuristic, and I'll share it with you because why not? Basically, in choosing friendships, you want to choose quality over quantity. Don't be sidetracked with narcissistic pursuits like how many Facebook friends do I have. None of that matters. It's all about the quality of the friendships, as Dunbar's number describes. But then once you have those friendships, it's about quantity, not quality, in terms of the time you spend with people. So I once heard it said that there's no such thing as quality time, only quantity time. You need to spend time with people. Now, on average between genders, the way that time's spent differs. Men, for example, tend to do things together, activities, and women tend to talk and relate more. But whatever it is, it's about that frequency of contact. So here's Robin to explain that concept.
What happens is, over time, you kind of don't see some guys that you used to see all the time. You don't see them so often. And what they'll do is they'll kind of drift down through the layers and settle out somewhere lower down. So you might spend a lot of time seeing a couple of guys, you go out drinking or climbing mountains or surfing or whatever it is you do every week. And then kind of one of you moves to Perth and the other stays in Sydney. And so you don't see each other very much. And the result of that is your relationship just kind of quietly dies away. And if it carries on for long enough without you two meeting up again, eventually the other person would just become an acquaintance, somebody I once knew. It might be nice to catch up with them if you're ever over in Perth again. But probably by that stage, and we're talking about maybe 4 or 5 years down the line now, when you do meet up, you kind of go, really? He was my best mate? Because your
You've got anyone in mind?
Your interests have diverged.
So thinking of anyone in particular there when you are?
No. This is general observation. I mean, we've watched this happening in the short-term scale, and it happens very, very quickly. You'll drop down one layer within about 6 months of not seeing somebody, because what maintains the layers is very, very specific frequencies of interaction, right? You have to see these people at least once a week to keep them in your 5 layer, at least once a month to keep them in your 15 layer, at least once a year to keep them within your 150 layer. And if you don't hit those numbers, and amazingly, you get exactly the same numbers if you look at how often people phone call each other or how often they post to each other on Facebook. But if you don't hit those numbers, that person will just drift over the boundary, fall off the cliff into the kind of layer outside, as it were, and they'll just be that bit less emotionally close to you.
Dunbar's numbers have positive lessons for how to manage our friendships, but there's another implication which is not as happy. They speak, Dunbar's numbers that is, to the inherent tribalism of the human species. The sort of tribalism epitomized by the old Bedouin proverb, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousins, me, my brother, and our cousins against our enemy. And I asked Robin Dunbar if this innate tribalism made him pessimistic about the future of the human species.
I'm perpetually pessimistic about our future. And partly I simply because history, kind of tells you that maintaining civilized relationships over very large areas, empires, or what have you, is extremely difficult through time.
One of the hallmarks and downsides of tribalism is broken conversations. And I'll never forget the moment when the penny dropped for me in late 2013. I was at university in a leadership role, and I was having a long-running debate with someone. I won't go into the whole story because we don't have time, but I realized in that moment that our beliefs are determined more by our group identities than any objective appraisal of the facts. And when we separate into groups, that's when conversation becomes impossible. A particularly disturbing example of this has manifested itself recently in one of the last places you'd expect the supposed bastions of truth and objectivity. I'm talking about universities. Since about 2013 in the Anglosphere, particularly elite liberal colleges in the US, but also on Australian campuses, groups of fragile students have begun asking for curtailments on free speech based on a combination of the flawed ideas of safetyism and identity politics, which is essentially a new form of tribalism. My next guest speaks to me about just that issue. It's the famed moral psychologist and Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University, Jonathan Haidt. Have a listen.
You have to really look out for the emergence of a set of ideas and a way of arguing. And you'll see it especially at your elite universities. And also you have to look at your elite, I don't know if you call them high schools, but the secondary schools, that students are in just before they come to university. And so if you see students arguing, not just about whether ideas are right or wrong, but if they start using terms like safe versus dangerous, you know you're in trouble, and this attitude is going to spread, and we can predict that depression and anxiety will follow. You also have to look out for the style of argument. College students need to learn how to do critical thinking, how to make assertions and back those assertions up with evidence, and how to challenge someone else's assertions with evidence and argument. And this new style, what happens with safetyism, is they almost never make actual arguments. It's almost all ad hominem or guilt by association. It's a style suited to the public square where your goal is to destroy your opponent. It's not a style suited to a community of discovery in which you challenge each other with arguments and evidence, and then over the process you all get smarter. That's the John Stuart Mill process. So what Greg and I have found is that since we've been writing about this in 2015, almost nobody has said that we're wrong. Almost nobody has actually been able to make an argument or adduce evidence that we're wrong. Rather, it's just argument after argument that is ad hominem. We're white men defending our privilege. We're winking at racists. We're encouraging the alt-right. That's all they ever say. And it got so bad that we actually put in a footnote in the book. I think it's in chapter 4. We put in a footnote saying, this new form of safetyism, this new culture, it doesn't make arguments on substance. It makes mostly ad hominem arguments. So we put that in, and we predicted. We said when a negative review is written, we predict it will mostly just talk about our white privilege and make ad hominem arguments. And sure enough, there's only been one really bad review. It was in The Guardian. It was by a woman in comparative literature in the humanities. And if you read that review closely, she never says that we're wrong. It's just guilt by association. My favorite one, she said, we quote, Haidt and Lukyanov quote Solzhenitsyn, as we do. And then she says, do you know who else likes Solzhenitsyn? Who wrote the introduction to a translation of Solzhenitsyn? Jordan Peterson. And this is an argument that, because Peterson and we both quote Solzhenitsyn, somehow this is supposed to mean that we're bad. It's ridiculous on many levels. But this is my point, that if you see this style of hyper-politicized argument that relies on ad hominem and guilt by association, people have to call it out, root it out. You should not allow this in your universities or your schools. It's very bad for the students. It's very bad for cooperation. If you want to build a tolerant, inclusive, and diverse community, people have to give each other the benefit of the doubt and work together. This new style of common enemy identity politics guarantees eternal anger and division. It can never lead to a successfully diverse society.
Lest I be accused of co-hosting a pessimistic podcast where all we talk about is tribalism and housing bubbles, I want to finish on some optimism. And one of the great antidotes to cynicism is a philosophy and a movement known as effective altruism. I've been involved in the movement for about 3 years, had a very minor role in the first Australian EA conference in Melbourne in 2016. And effective altruism is about, well, you know what? Instead of defining it for you, I'll let Peter Singer do that. Peter Singer, the world's most influential living moral philosopher, who was a guest on the podcast last year. Here's Peter to define effective altruism.
Effective altruism is an emerging movement of people who are concerned, firstly, to live altruistically to some extent, and secondly, they want to do that effectively. So these two elements are not always combined. Strangely, perhaps in the field of philanthropy and charity, a lot of people feel that as long as your heart is in the right place, it doesn't matter what you do. The effective altruism movement says, no, it does matter a lot what you do, because you could have 10 times or maybe 100 times or maybe even sometimes 1,000 times more positive impact if you think about where you're going to use your time or your money or whatever it is, than if you just give with your heart without that thought.
Now, if effective altruism is about doing the most good possible, well, what are the specific cause areas we should be working on? Where can we have the most impact? The next highlight I'll share is a conversation I recorded in Berkeley, California with Rob Wiblin. Now, Rob is a young Australian guy and he's the director of research at 80,000 Hours. 80,000 Hours is an EA, or effective altruism, organisation, and it's kind of like the Navy SEALs for if you want to have an impactful career. They've done all of this research on how to have the most impact and which areas are the most neglected and the most in need of our service. And it's interesting because it's led to a rather unusual list of cause areas. So the things that 80,000 Hours recommends we work on if we're interested in having a career impact are global priorities research, pandemic prevention, artificial intelligence, preventing wars between great powers, nuclear security, and improving decision-making in government, to name just a few. So how on earth did they arrive at this unusual shopping list of cause areas? Well, here's Rob Wiblin to explain exactly their criteria for selecting them. This is cool. Have a listen.
We dived into talking about like what problems we think are most pressing in the world. But it's worth taking a step back and thinking about kind of how we assess problems to try to shortlist the ones that we think are most important for people to focus on. So the three criteria that we look at in each of our problem profiles, or each time we review a new problem area, is importance, tractability, and neglectedness. So importance or scale is we try to measure how many people are affected by this problem and how much. So, for example, if you were thinking about working on curing a disease, we would look at how many people have this disease, how many people are forecasted to have it in future, and how bad is it for each of those people. How much does it cause them to suffer, or how much does it interfere with their life? Then for tractability or solvability, we think, well, if we increase the resources going towards solving this problem by 10%, what fraction of that problem would we be likely to solve? Or like what would be our probability of completely fixing it? Perhaps if you're thinking of just inventing a complete cure for a disease. So that gives you some idea of how easy is it to fix? Because there's some issues that are like very big in scale and no one's working on them, but that's because you can't fix them. So it would be great if we could invent a perpetual motion machine that would solve a lot of the world's problems. We'd have unlimited energy, but it's an intractable problem. And then there's neglectedness, which we often find drives a lot of the differences between the problems. So, because when people start working on a problem, they tend to choose the most impactful things first, and then once they've done that, they move on to things that seem solutions that seem somewhat less promising. You get this thing called declining returns. So if you're the first person to work on a problem, you can probably have a lot more impact than if you're the 100th person to arrive or the millionth person to arrive working on a problem. So we very often look for issues that we think are big in scale and can be solved, but that not many people are working on them. So a lot of your listeners will be worried about climate change. And we basically agree with the consensus view that this is like a very serious problem that could be destabilizing for civilization. But there is a lot of money spent already and a lot of people focusing their careers on preventing climate change. And for that reason, we suspect that a lot of the low-hanging fruit is already being taken, that a lot of the most impactful things that people can do are already being done. And adding one more person to that effort won't make such a huge contribution. Whereas some of the other problems that I mentioned, they're potentially similar in scales, similar in importance, or similar in the kind of risk that they present to humanity, but there's far fewer people who are focusing their whole career on solving those problems. And that's basically why they end up looking particularly important. And this is a reason why we think if you're looking for the most impactful things to do, they're going to be weird because things that seem absolutely common sense, lots of people have already noticed them and started working on them, and you probably heard of them before.
Right.
So we think of it as it's inevitably going to be the case that if we're doing our job, the things that we're suggesting are going to seem a bit counterintuitive in some way. They probably shouldn't seem absolutely crazy, but they're not going to be completely mainstream. And as we've done more and more research, I think our advice has moved further and further away from the mainstream, which is exactly what you'd expect, because we start out mostly knowing about what other people know, and we're not yet ready, perhaps, to make bets that are strongly against the consensus. But as we learn more and we think about these ideas and run them past other people and check them, you can become gradually more confident that the ideas that you have that not everyone already believes are actually worth pursuing. That maybe they're not guaranteed to be right, but they've got a good enough shot that this is kind of the highest impact thing that at least we're able to work on.
Okay, I'm glad you backed up. So this sort of makes sense of that list of very unusual cause areas.
Yeah, or at least somewhat obscure issues.
Yeah.
So let's move on perhaps to the risk thing. So yeah, people will have noticed that a lot of the issues that I mentioned were about kind of risk management and risk management at kind of a civilizational level. So what's going on there? I think there's two main drivers. One is that when you're thinking about how to improve welfare as much as possible, one issue that's kind of neglected in our view is the very long term. So there's about 8 billion people alive now, but humanity could potentially continue for hundreds or thousands of years, potentially even longer. So there might be, until humanity dies out, there could be potentially trillions of people who live. And their interests are not hugely represented in kind of the political system, or people don't tend to pay a lot of attention to that. There's some discussion of intergenerational equity, but given the magnitude of the damage that we could do to them, and the number of people or the number of beings that could potentially exist in the future, I think that the long term doesn't get as much weight as probably it ought to. And that's a reason why issues that affect future generations primarily, we think are kind of neglected by our economic and political system. And you can see that in climate change, but I think that the same thing is played out in these other problem areas. And we're particularly focused on problems that we think could lead to human extinction, because that would preclude the existence of all of these future generations. So, if we were to have a nuclear war that resulted in all people dying, that would be absolutely terrible for the current generation, one of the worst things really possible. But it would also be a catastrophe for all of the future generations that could have existed. And I have an episode with the philosopher Toby Ord about this issue of, how should we think about intergenerational equity and the long-term future, and how much weight should we give it relative to other things. So that's one reason to focus on kind of making sure that humanity doesn't die out, or that civilization doesn't really run off the rails. Another reason why we focus on these risk management things is, as you said, we think humanity people in general are quite poor at thinking about risk. And I think there are good evolutionary reasons for that, that the kind of risks that we faced in the historical environment where the human mind was evolving are not really like the ones that we face now. We could, since we invented nuclear weapons, we did have the ability to just cause the human race to end. But there was nothing like that in the ancestral environment. And so we don't really think that much about tail risks and kind of these extreme but somewhat unlikely events. It's very hard for us to get for them to have quite the emotional salience that they ought to have, for them to scare us as much as they should. And for that reason, tail risks often get neglected, but at the same time, sometimes they get overweighted. So terrorists, for example, exploit the fact that if something is extremely visually distinctive, if they do precisely the things that kind of terrify us, even if they're not necessarily killing that many people. And so they can make us overweight particular risks.
Yeah, this is called the availability heuristic.
Yeah, so the availability heuristic is that we assess how common things are by how much we can remember them. And because terrorist attacks are so vivid, so striking, we tend to think that they're more common than they are because they stick out in our memory. So, there's ways that we can end up paying too much attention to particular risks, and also ways that we can end up neglecting them. And it's basically something that we're not terribly good at reasoning about as individuals, nor as a civilization or as countries. So, we've spoken to people in government about these issues, bureaucrats and politicians, and they'll often say, you're right. These are like very serious risks that we're facing, and someone should be focused on that. But I can't do that because that's not what the electorate demands. There's no money for it in our budget. There's no political demand for it. So this is just something that I don't have the discretion to work on, even though I think it's very important. And so basically, the fact that we're not terribly good at reasoning about risk, and particularly about like high stakes, low probability risks, goes up the political system and means that as a civilization, as a species, we're just kind of flying blind. Not nearly as much resources is given to these things, and not nearly as much reasoning goes into these things as would be ideal.
The final highlight I'm going to share is a conversation I recorded in Sydney last year with David Christian. David is the founder of a new school of history known as Big History, which is like an interdisciplinary macro approach to history from the Big Bang to today. David has been so successful in this new way of looking at the world that Bill Gates joined with him and helped fund the Big History Project, which they co-founded together, which teaches big history in high schools. David is about to step us through the 8 thresholds, as he calls them, 8 singular moments in the history of the universe. He's going to tell you the story from the Big Bang to today. It's like a mini TED Talk, this highlight. And the reason I'm sharing it, to continue my promise of finishing on a note of optimism, is because I think things like Big History are also a tonic to tribalism. Because the more we zoom out, the more we realize we have in common. And the more we see that we are all just essentially apes on a spinning rock flying through the galaxy, the more we'll probably cut each other some slack and give each other the benefit of the doubt. That's very important. So, over to David Christian.
There is a plot. This is great. It's a story. You can look at this colossal body of information. You can find a story there if you look for it. And the story goes like this, that our universe popped up 13.8 billion years ago. We don't know why or how, but something the size of an atom pops up somewhere in space and time, and it's expanding like crazy, and it contains everything in our universe. And the scientific evidence that that story is true is now incredibly good. Well, lots of details we still have to figure out. But the early universe was very simple. If you look at the universe about 400,000 years after the Big Bang, that's about as long as humans have been around on Earth, by the way. You can think of it as a kind of thin mist of hydrogen and helium atoms. There are no other elements, spread more or less evenly everywhere. Everything is at the same temperature. There's also photons of light traveling through these atoms. There's dark matter which we don't understand. There's dark energy which we don't understand. But there's not much structure here. There's not much complexity. So over 13.8 billion years, now you look at our world today, staggering complexity. Every time I fly a plane, I just think of the number of moving parts that have to get right for this thing to work. Staggering complexity. So here's the question. How do you get from that very simple early universe to this incredibly rich, gorgeous, world that we live in today? And there's a villain to this story. The villain is entropy. You can think of I like to think of entropy sometimes as sort of, dark glasses, twirling a moustache, and cackling away in the background. As what entropy tries to do is break down every structure. So every time the universe comes up with something interesting, entropy says, I'll smash you.
This is the second law of thermodynamics.
This is the second law of thermodynamics. So entropy is the villain. So the question is, how, if entropy is spending all its time trying to break down structures, how is it possible to get from that simple early universe to today? So you asked about thresholds. So this is the role of the thresholds. Now, there's nothing, the idea of thresholds is not strictly a scientific concept. It's an organizational concept. Mm-hmm. It's a way of helping you through the story. But so what I've focused on in the way I teach this and write about it is just 8 moments. Now, we could have 1,000, but, 8 seems to work pretty well. It could be 6, it could be 10, Moments in the universe at which suddenly something, somewhere in the universe, where the conditions are just right, you have the right Goldilocks conditions, something new appears. And when that happens, it's always magical. It's like watching a baby being born. You think, where did this come from? And we sort of know the general answer. The general answer is that things that already existed were suddenly rearranged in new ways so that they had new qualities that had never existed before. And that's true of a baby. When a baby is born, you said, nothing like this baby has ever existed before. So that's what the thresholds are. And they build. Complexity builds on complexity. So very quickly, the 8 thresholds I focus on, and, if you could tell the story differently and focus on different ones, are the first is the Big Bang itself. Without a universe, there's no story. So that's the first threshold. The universe provides us with the raw materials for everything. It provides us with a certain stock of energy. Now, the first law of thermodynamics tells us that stock of energy is fixed. It's never going to change. The second law tells us that the form that energy takes will change. And only when energy itself has some sort of structure, it's what the physicists call free energy, can you actually use energy to do something. If everything is pushing in the same direction, you can do something. It's like water from a waterfall. You can drive a turbine. But if it's all pushing every different way, it's just heat energy, it's random, it can't do anything. That's the energy entropy loves. So how can energy create new things? Well, in that early universe, you have energy. You also have a number of rules, and those rules guarantee that the energy will move in certain ways, not others. So a minimum of structure was guaranteed from the start. So threshold 1, the universe. Threshold 2, probably within 200 or 300 million years, we get the first stars, is the creation of stars. A universe with stars already has a lot more structure. Stars have structure. You now have gradients of heat and light and density. You have galaxies. It's a lot more interesting. Then threshold 3, inside dying stars, you create new atoms. So you create the whole suite of elements of the periodic table. Now, most of the universe still consists of hydrogen and helium, but 2% consists of all the other atoms. So now the universe is much richer in terms of material variety, and those atoms can combine. So suddenly you can create new types of stuff. And we see clouds of atoms in the galaxies, and we can see molecules forming, including amino acids and the sort of things we're made of. So that's our threshold 3, the creation of new elements. Threshold 4, using those elements, so some of them form, molecules of silica, dust. Some of them form water or ice, H2O. Using these new materials, you can create new types of objects, planets and moons and asteroids. You can create solar systems. And we now know there are billions of them. So threshold 4 is solar systems and planets. And on the surface of particularly rocky planets, you have an incredibly interesting chemical environment. You've got a great diversity of different chemical elements because most of the hydrogen and helium has been driven away. You have water, a fabulous environment for rich chemistry. That takes us to threshold 5. Now, we only know of life on planet Earth, but I think the betting at the moment is that the universe is crawling with bacterial life. You know, whenever you get rocky planets with these rich conditions, gentle flows of energy, lots of elements, lots of water, or liquid, it could be methane liquid, you probably get something that we could call life. And life's utterly different because living things have something we can think of as purpose or meaning. So suddenly information and meaning becomes important. Bacteria have to know whether the environment is alkaline or acid, which direction they should move. So living things have purpose. They're trying to survive and they're trying to reproduce. So that's threshold 5, is life. We only know of it on Earth, but the betting is there's lots of it. Then, now, this is the point at which the story could be getting a bit human-centered, you know. So if there are any Martians or aliens who read this book, this is the point at which they may throw it away and say, what about the Martians? What about the aliens, you know? Threshold 6 is humans. So I argue, and I think it's probably right, that the appearance of humans on planet Earth, and you have to hang around about 4.5 billion years before you get humans, is a big, big deal. And the reason is language. We're the first species that can exchange information so richly that information accumulates across generations. So with this organism, human beings, wait a few thousand years and you find, you know, information is accumulating. They've got more technology. Now, information for a living organism is power. If you know about your environment, you can extract more energy from it, you can extract more food from it, your populations can grow. So with human beings over 200,000 years, this process of accumulating information has got faster and faster and faster. And the result is we've got more and more powerful. Until today, we dominate change on an entire planet. The entire planet's changing, and it's changing in my lifetime, because suddenly there is this collective being, which is humans, who sort of rule the biosphere. Now, at the moment, we don't fully understand that role, and we have to get across it very quickly. We have to become adults, and we have to realize we are managing a planet. We just have to do it well. And that's a challenge we're going to have to take up in the next 50 or 100 years. That's the challenge for a younger generation, to become good planetary managers. And this is like an explosive moment in the history of the planet. Suddenly, there's a species managing the planet. Can we do it well? Now, thresholds 7 and 8 are really within human history, the appearance of agriculture and the appearance of the fossil fuels revolution 200 years ago. That change gave us access to vastly more energy than ever before. And the fossil fuels revolution, I think, or modernity or industrialization, whatever you want to call it, explains why the changes in the last 2 centuries have been so explosive and so rapid and have suddenly turned us into a planet-changing species.
Thanks so much for enjoying that highlights reel with me. If you enjoy what we did last year, if you enjoy what we're doing, or what we're continuing to do into 2019, I'd be indebted if you'd share us with your friends, share us on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. We have an amazing audience. We're very grateful for you. You're smart, you're open-minded, you're generous. Some of you are certifiably crazy, but in a good way, and we love it when we hear from you. Keep reaching out by email, thejollyswagman@gmail.com. Keep reaching out on Twitter @jollyswagmanpod. Keep the conversation alive. We've got plenty more to come. 2019 is going to be crazy. Thank you for your time.